إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Then to continue with Riyadh al-Salihin of Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, then we were on still Kitab al-Fada'il, the 8th book of the book of virtues. And the last chapter that we had was chapter 187, Babu Fadl al-Salawat, the book of the virtue, the excellence of the salawat, the 5 daily prayers, the prayers. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, he follows this with chapter 188 of the chapter numbers and the hadith numbers as occur in the version of Shaykh Muhammad Nasiruddin al-Albani rahimahullah. Then follows chapter 188, Babu Fadli Salati Subhi wal Asr, the chapter of the virtue of the Subh, the dawn prayer, and of the Asr prayer. The book of the virtue of the dawn prayer, the Subh prayer, which is the Fajr prayer, and of the Asr prayer. So with regard to this chapter, then Shaykh Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah, he introduces this chapter by saying, the author rahimahullah ta'ala said, chapter, the virtue of the dawn prayer and the Asr prayer. These two prayers have special virtue. I mean, in addition to the general virtue that all the prayers have, but these two, he said, these two have special virtue, which is not found in others besides them. It's not found in the other prayers. The other prayers have virtue, but they have an extra virtue, which is only in these two. So as for the Fajr prayer, then Allah, the Exalted and Most High, said, أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر إن قرآن الفجر كان مشهودا. Surah Al-Isra, the 17th surah, ayah 78, with the explanation. Establish the prayer from when the sun inclines until the darkness of the night, and recite the Quran in the dawn prayer, in the Fajr prayer. Indeed, the recitation in the Fajr prayer is witnessed. Shaykh Uthaymeen said, explaining, Allah and His angels witness it. What it means by the recitation, the Fajr prayer, being witnessed, mean Allah and His angels witness it. This is a tremendous virtue. Yarhamakallah. This is a tremendous virtue. And also it has the first, so that's the first quality, the first special quality for the Fajr prayer, that is witnessed, specially witnessed by Allah and His angels. Then he said, and it also has the special quality that it is separate from the rest of the 5 daily prayers. It is on its own with regard to its time. It's a second virtue for the Fajr prayer. It's the only prayer that is not connected at either end to any of the other prayers. It's singled out on its own. And then the Shaykh explains that. He said, so it is between the Isha prayer, or rather he said, so between it and between the Isha prayer, the prayer which comes before it, there is the last half of the night. And between it, the Fajr prayer, and the Dhuhr prayer, the next one, there is half of the day. And the Fajr is in the middle of a gap of half the night and a gap of half the day. It's not connected to any other prayer time. A second virtue of the prayer. He said, and this is an important point because some people ask the question very often with regard to the Isha prayer. So what time does the Isha prayer finish? It's obviously a matter of fiqh. What time does the time for Isha finish? The time for Isha begins when the twilight, the redness, in the correct sense, the redness of twilight has disappeared after sunset. The redness is gone. then the Isha begins. But what time does Isha finish? And just as a side point, as a reminder, then many of the scholars hold that the time for Isha, it continues until Fajr appears. However, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, as we can see here, and just as Shaykh al-Albani, rahimahullah, and other scholars besides them they held the view of those scholars, the correct saying, inshaAllah, that the Isha prayer does not last, its time does not last until Fajr. It lasts until half the night, halfway through the night. And again, as a side point, that doesn't mean 12 o'clock. Again, many people understand it means 12. When the clock says 12, that's the end of Isha time. It's not 12. It's halfway, as Shaykh Uthaymeen puts it, it's halfway between Maghrib and the appearance of Fajr. Halfway between Maghrib prayer and the appearance of Fajr, whatever time that is. And so these days, just at the moment, it varies throughout the year, in the winter and the summer. At the moment, for example, just soon after 11:15 or something, just as a point, it's not 12 o'clock as some people think. It's not always 12 o'clock, sometimes it may be, sometimes it's not. So anyway, the Shaykh is making the point here that the Isha prayer, it lasts until half the night. That's the end of its time. He said, because the time of Isha ends when half of the night comes, and it does not extend to the appearance of the Fajr. So when it is the middle of the night, then the time for the Isha prayer has ended. And then the half that remains up until Fajr is not a time for an obligatory prayer. Rather, it is the time of the tahajjud, the prayer in the night time, the optional prayer in the night, supererogatory prayer in the night time. Liman waffaqahu Allahu azza wa jal. It is the time for tahajjud, for those people whom Allah, the Mighty Majestic, guides and grants success to. He guides them to praying the tahajjud, the optional tahajjud prayer in the night. That's after the half the night till Fajr. It's the time for that prayer. And he said, as for from the appearance of the sun, the rising of the sun, until when the sun inclines, just before Dhuhr, just at the start of Dhuhr, then this is also not a time for an obligatory prayer. Rather, it is a time for unrestricted prayer, such as the duha, the forenoon prayer, and the like of that. So therefore, the Fajr prayer, it has the quality that it is witnessed, and it has the quality that it is singled out with regard to its time. Its time is not joined to what came before it, nor is it joined to what comes after it. Again, as a side point here as well, keep bringing side points in. This ayah, one of the strong evidences that Shaykh Uthaymeen brings when he explains the matter elsewhere, to prove that the Fajr prayer, its time is separate, it's not joined to the Isha, it's not Isha stretches all the way and then Fajr begins, is the ayah that he quoted here, Surah Al-Isra, the 17th surah, ayah 78. أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس إلى غسق الليل وقرآن الفجر. This, with the explanation, establish the prayer from when the sun inclines away. And the people of knowledge, they differ slightly in explanation of it, but a number of them explain it to mean from when the sun inclines, the start from the zawal, from the middle of the sky. To pray from then, you pray the Dhuhr prayer, you pray the Asr prayer, you pray the Maghrib prayer, ila ghasaq al-layl, up until the darkness, the middle of the night. So that is all those prayers joined together. That part of the ayah describes those prayers. Wa Qur'an al-Fajr, and then there's a wa, and the Fajr time is joined onto it, and the recitation of the Fajr. So Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions that the Fajr in this ayah is made separate from all the other prayers. So that's an indication that its time is separate. Wallahu a'lam. Anyway, back to what the Shaykh was saying. Then he mentioning the virtue of the Fajr prayer, the two virtues of the Fajr prayer. Firstly, that it is witnessed, meaning it's witnessed by Allah and His angels. Secondly, that it is singled out with regard to its time. The prayer before it is not connected to it, the prayer after it is not connected to it. Then he said, as for the Asr prayer, then it has the special quality that it is as-salatul wusta, it is the middle prayer. Because the middle prayer, by the text of the hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the asr prayer. In the footnote they mention this hadith is reported by Al-Bukhari in the hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam clearly mentions that the salat al-wusta, the middle prayer, is the asr prayer. Hadith reported by Al-Bukhari as hadith 2931 and by Muslim as hadith 627. So that's the first virtue of the asr prayer, that it is the salat al-wusta, the middle prayer. It's singled out with this name and this title, the middle prayer. And it has the quality, the special quality, that Allah the Most High has indicated its virtue and its honor when He particularized it with a mention after having stated generally the prayers. So He said, Hafidhu ala salawat. Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah, ayah 238. In the first part of this first part of the ayah that's quoted, that Allah the Most High commands with the explanation, guard the prayers. So the prayers are mentioned in general. Guard, the command, guard or be careful to observe the prayers. The Shaykh said this is general, meaning the prayers general. And then was-salatil wusta, with the explanation, and the middle prayer. First there's a command, guard the prayers, general. And then the specific one is mentioned. And the middle prayer. The Shaykh said, the asr prayer. So he mentioned it specifically. He mentioned it specifically because of its virtue. And then there are virtues and distinctive qualities which are shared between the Fajr prayer and the Asr prayer. And from them is what the author, rahimahullah, indicates in this chapter. So the Shaykh has made it clear, 2 great virtues for the Fajr prayer, 2 virtues for the Asr prayer, and then there are virtues which are shared between both of them. And they are the ones indicated in the hadith of the chapter. So with regard to the narrations in the chapter, then just to take the first ones from the chapter. So as for the first hadith, hadith 1054, عن أبي موسى رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من صلى البردين دخل الجنة متفق عليه البردان الصبح والعصر. From Abu Musa radiallahu anhu, that Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, whoever prays the 2 cool ones will enter paradise, agreed upon. And Nawawi said the 2 cool ones are the subh, the dawn prayer, and the asr. As for who reports this hadith, then first of all we had this hadith many years ago, in fact. The hadith came, we had it as hadith number 132, and in the version of Shaykh al-Albani it comes as hadith number 134 in the 13th chapter, the chapter of the many paths of good, the many paths to attain good. As for who reports the hadith, then the hadith indeed, as An-Nawawi rahimahullah said, reported by Al-Bukhari, and you'll find it there in the book of the times of the prayers, chapter 26, the virtue of the Fajr prayer. Hadith number 574. Also reported, just as he said, by Muslim in the book of mosques and places of prayer. Chapter 37 from the numbering of An-Nawawi, hadith number 635. And reported by Imam Ahmad and Al-Baghawi in Sharh al-Sunnah. As for a couple of the phrases, 2 of the phrases in the hadith to explain, then al-bardain, man salla al-bardain, whoever prays the 2 cool ones. Then Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar said in Fath al-Bari, what is meant is the Fajr prayer and the Asr prayer. Then he said, Al-Khattabi said, the great scholar and Imam Al-Khattabi, who died in the year 388, Al-Khattabi said, they are called the two cool ones because they are prayed at the two cool parts of the daytime. I mean, there are two of the daytime prayers which are prayed in the daylight hours at the two ends. He said they're prayed at the two cool parts of the daytime, and they are its two ends at the time when the atmosphere becomes fine and good and the severity of the heat has passed away. As for his saying, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, dakhal al-jannah, that whoever does that, then he will enter paradise. Shaykh Ali al-Qari, a scholar well known as Mullah Ali al-Qari, great scholar of India, who died in the year 1014, he said in his explanation of Mishkat, Mirqat al-Mafatih, he said, أي دخولا أوليا. I mean, he will enter paradise, he said, meaning entering right away, meaning with the initial entry. Actually, what that's referring to is that we know, as a side point the scholars make clear, that there will be people who will enter paradise before others. There will be an initial entry, and as we know from authentic narrations, for example, that the poor people from this nation, they'll enter before the rich. And then those who have entered the fire, for example, those who are people of Tawheed, but they have major sins upon them, and they are punished and not forgiven, they're entered into the fire, and then they're taken out, then they will enter into paradise. So people will enter, there will be an initial entry, then there will be others entering, and so forth. So he said the meaning of this hadith, Shaykh Ali al-Qari said, dakhal al-jannah, meaning entering right away. Then a side point here, a point of note, because sometimes people take the like of this text and they wrongly take it, and they think, for example, okay, a person prays Fajr and prays asar. What about if he doesn't pray the rest of the prayers? Or what about if he commits major sins and whatever? He's guaranteed paradise. So there's an important point here of note that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah brings. You'll find it in Majmu' al-Fatawa, volume 6, page 427. He was speaking about a similar hadith with regard to entry into paradise, and he was speaking about the general principle with regard to texts where there is a promise of paradise or promise of reward. So he mentioned the principle, and he said, I'm sorry if the wording is quite difficult to translate. If the translation doesn't make much sense, then sorry, but we'll try and explain it, inshallah. He said, something which is mentioned as being a result which is necessitated by an action might not actually occur. And this does not affect the action being something which brings about the result. I mean, the fact that we find a text, for example, a text here, that whoever prays the two prayers, the Fajr and the Asr prayer, will enter paradise. What if a person who does pray those two prayers doesn't enter into paradise? What is the problem here? Does that mean that, well, okay, then praying those two prayers is not actually a reason for entering into paradise? So he's making the principle here. That something which is mentioned as being a result necessitated by an action which is done, that result might not occur. But this does not affect the action being something which brings about that result. Just like the rest of the ahadith which contain a promise. Because when it is said, whoever prays the two cool prayers will enter paradise, or whoever does such and such will enter paradise, it shows that this action is a sabab, is a cause or a means for entry into paradise, no doubt. Even if what it necessitates does not come about, meaning in certain cases that result doesn't come about on account of a person's kufr, unbelief, or fisq, I mean major sin. I mean, it may be that person, for example, a person does this action, but then he has, for example, he's an unbeliever, commits unbelief, or does some major sin that necessitates entry into the fire for punishment. And the problem is not with the action, with the Fajr and the Asr prayer. The problem is with himself putting some preventing factor in there that prevents him from the result. So that's the principle that Shaykh is making there. Shaykh al-Islam, that is. As for the points of benefit that can be derived from the hadith, then amongst them are the following 2 points of benefit. Firstly, that which An-Nawawi quoted as a chapter heading for the hadith here and in his explanation of Muslim. That this hadith, he said, he brings a heading, it shows the virtue of the 2 prayers, of the Fajr and the asar. In fact, I've only got 1 point of benefit here, so it's 1 point of benefit. In addition to that, some of the scholars have mentioned the reason why that these 2 prayers have been given that virtue. That these 2 prayers in particular, whoever prays these 2 prayers, it's mentioned, he will enter into paradise. Then there's 2 main explanations the scholars have given. Firstly is the explanation given by Al-Munawi in his book, Kashf al-Manahij wa Tanaqih. And this Al-Munawi is not the Munawi that we usually hear mentioned. This is Munawi is a different one. The one that we usually have, the explainer of Al-Jami' al-Saghir and Fayd al-Qadir. That was Abdul Ra'uf al-Munawi, who died in the year 1031. That's the one that we usually hear quoted in Fayd al-Qadir. The one that's being mentioned here was a teacher of Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, who died much earlier. He died in the year 803. And he was Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Munawi, as we said, from the teachers of Ibn Hajar. So he wrote a book connected to the Mishkat, where he quotes the references for the hadith contained in the Mishkat, and he quotes some explanation as well. So in that book, Al-Munawi, the earlier one, said, these 2 are mentioned specifically. These 2 prayers, the Fajr and the Asr, are mentioned specifically with this virtue because of the fact that they are witnessed. They are witnessed by the angels. And the second explanation, second reason that the scholars give as well, is something which Ibn Allan mentioned in his explanation of Riyad al-Salihin, Dalil al-Falihin, that he said, the reason why they are particularly mentioned specifically is that the dawn prayer, its time is at the time of sleep and its delight. And the time of the Asr prayer is a time when people are preoccupied with completing the work of the day and with its business and with preparing for the evening meal. So a person praying these 2, along with that, is a proof that his soul is free from laziness and that it loves worship, ibadah. And that then necessitates that he will carry out the rest of the prayers. It doesn't just mean that he only prays those 2 prayers in the day and that's the end. No. A person like this, they're the hardest. They're the hardest of the prayers. One is preoccupied with sleep, the other one is preoccupied with business, but still he carries out those 2 prayers. So he makes the point, and that necessitates that he will carry out the rest of the prayers. And that if he observes these 2, then he will even more carefully observe the rest of them. So the fact that these 2 are mentioned alone is for the reason we have already mentioned. It does not mean that a person who restricts himself to those 2, he only prays those 2 prayers. He reads the like of this hadith and says, well, I'll just pray those 2 prayers. It doesn't mean that, he said. It does not mean that a person who restricts himself to these 2 and then leaves out the rest of them will obtain that reward, because that is contrary to the texts. It means contrary to all the rest of the texts of the book and the Sunnah. As for the next hadith, hadith 1055, وعن أبي زهير عمارة بن رؤيبة رضي الله عنه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول لن يلج النار أحد صلى قبل طلوع الشمس وقبل غروبها يعني الفجر والعصر رواه Muslim. And from Abu Zuhair Umara ibn Ru'aybah radiallahu anhu, who said, I heard Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam say, one who prays before the rising of the sun and before its setting will not enter the fire. Meaning the Fajr and the Asr prayer. Reported by Muslim. As for who reports this hadith, then indeed, as An-Nawawi rahimahullah said, it's indeed reported by Muslim, and you'll find it there in the same book as before, the book of the prayer and places of the prayer. Hadith number 634. Also reported by Abu Dawood in the book of the prayer, chapter 9, guarding the time of the prayers, hadith number 427, and reported by An-Nasa'i in the book of the prayer, chapter 21, the virtue of the Salatul Jama'ah, the virtue of the congregational prayer, hadith 487, and reported by Imam Ahmad as well. And as for a brief biography of the companion, then very briefly, the companion of the hadith radiallahu an is Abu Zuhair Umara ibn Ru'aybah al-Thaqafi. Is from the tribe of Banu Jusham ibn Thaqif. In later life, he went to settle in the city of Kufa. He lived in Kufa, and he died, or he lived until after the year 70. He reported 9 hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and from those hadith, Muslim reports 2 of the hadith. Obviously, one of them being this one, and the other one, we could set it as homework, but I'll make it easy for you, inshallah. The other one occurs in the book of the Jumu'ah prayer, hadith number 874. Now, with regard to the hadith itself, with regard to a couple of the wordings from the hadith, lan yalij an-nar. Then Shaykh Ali al-Qari said, in his explanation of Mishkat, Mirqat al-Mafatih, he said, meaning he will not enter the fire. And Shaykh Albani said the same thing, meaning he will not enter the fire. Lan yalija means he will not enter the fire. Shaykh Ali al-Qari continued, meaning aslan lit-ta'dhib aw ala wajh at-ta'bid. Said means he will not enter the fire, whoever prays the prayer before the rising of the sun and prayer before its setting, he will not enter the fire, meaning he will not enter it at all to be punished. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Or he will not enter it and remain in it forever. It could cover either of those two meanings. Meaning he'll either be a person who doesn't enter the fire whatsoever for punishment at all, or it can be that he won't enter it in an entry that means he will stay there forever. One of those. صلى قبل طلوع الشمس وقبل غروبها. The person who prays before the rising of the sun and before its setting. Then Shaykh Ali al-Qari again, he said, meaning he is constant upon performing them. Obviously meaning he doesn't just one day he reads hadith, one day he prays those 2 prayers and that's it, and then he leaves it off. No, he's constant upon it. Constant upon praying those 2 prayers. And the explainer, Ibn Allan, he said, there's quite a long quote from him, Ibn Allan said, and that necessitates his carrying out the rest of the 5 daily prayers. And that if these 2 are guarded, I mean, he brings the same point, these are the 2 most difficult ones. So I said, and if these 2 prayers are observed, carried out, then the rest of them will be even more carefully guarded. And therefore Allah, the Most High, has praised, and he mentioned before that, it's a long quote, he mentioned before that, these are prayers which come, the Fajr prayer comes at a time of sleep, the same point we heard before, the Fajr time comes at a prayer of sleep and its delight, the Asr time comes at a time of preoccupation with matters of this world and finishing off the jobs for the day and the like. So he said, and therefore Allah the Most High has praised those people who abandon sleep and its delight, and abandon business and its profit. So when I say abandon, I mean not totally abandon, I mean up to a point, a partial abandonment. They abandon that in favor of the aspect of worship of Him and obedience to Him. So He, the Majestic and Most High, or they said, He, the Mighty and Majestic, said, كَانُوا قَلِيلًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ مَا يَهْجَعُونَ. Surah Al-Dhariyat, 51st Surah, Ayah 17. Allah the Most High said, with regard to the believers, concerning them, with the explanation, they used to sleep only a little during the night. And He said, رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Surah An-Nur, the 24th Surah, Ayah 37. With the explanation, men who are not diverted by trade, nor by business, away from the remembrance of Allah. He said the two ayahs. He said, and therefore, I mean that being the case, that these are people who are not diverted by sleep, and they're not diverted by work, away from remembrance of Allah. He said, that being the case, then it will be extremely likely that this person does not commit any major sin, nor does he commit a minor sin connected to the rights of the people. And if he does so, then he repents. And his lesser sins, which are connected to the right of Allah the Most High, will be wiped away. So therefore, in that case, he will not enter the fire at all. At all. In a person who carries out these two prayers with the difficulty involved in them, and even more so that he will be a person who is like that. He doesn't commit major sins, doesn't commit lesser sins which are connected to the rights of the people. If he does so, if he commits any sins, then he repents. And then any lesser sins which he does, which are connected only to Allah's right, can be wiped away. And therefore he said, and therefore he will not enter the fire at all. As for the main point of benefit from the hadith, then again the same main point of benefit as in the first hadith, as was mentioned by An-Nawawi rahimahullah, that this hadith shows the virtue of those two prayers, the virtue of the two prayers of the dawn and the asr. As for the next hadith, or before that, before moving on to the next hadith, the explanation of Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, that he said, firstly, whoever prays the two cool prayers will enter paradise. And the two cool prayers, they are the Fajr prayer and the Asr prayer. Because the Fajr prayer comes at a time of the coolness of the night. The coolest of the time in the night is at its end. And the Asr prayer comes at a time of coolness in the day. The coolest part of the day is at its end. So therefore, he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man salla al-bardain dakhala al-jannah." Whoever prays the two cool prayers will enter paradise. So that's with regard to the first hadith, and with regard to the second hadith, he said, likewise, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed, "La yaliju an-nar ahadun salla qabla tulu'i ash-shamsi wa qabla ghurubiha." That a person will not enter the fire who prays before the rising of the sun and before its setting. He said, meaning the Fajr prayer and the Asr prayer. So the first of these contains affirmation of entry into paradise, and the second contains a negation of entry into the fire. So therefore, this is just like his saying, He the Most High, فَمَنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةِ فَقَدْ فَازَ. Surah Al-Imran, the third surah, ayah 185. With the explanation, so whoever is kept away from the fire and he has entered into paradise, then he has truly succeeded. نسأل الله تعالى أن يجعلنا وإياكم من المحافظين على الصلوات والصلاة الوسطى وأن يحرمنا على النار ويدخلنا الجنة إنه على كل شيء قدير. Ameen. The Shaykh made dua saying, I ask Allah the Most High that He makes us and you from those people who are careful upon observing the prayers and the middle prayer, and that He forbids us for the fire and enters us into paradise. Indeed, He has full ability over everything. Amen. And with regard to the third hadith that we'll take as the last hadith today, inshaAllah, hadith 1056, وعن جندب بن سفيان رضي الله عنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من صلى الصبح فهو في ذمة الله فانظر يا ابن آدم لا يطلبنك الله من ذمته بشيء. رواه Muslim. And from Jundub ibn Sufyan radiyallahu anhu, who said, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, whoever prays the dawn prayer, then he is under the protection of Allah. So look, O son of Adam, do not let it be the case that Allah has to call you to account for anything that lies under His guarantee of protection. Reported by Muslim. So as for who reports this hadith, then firstly, again, this is a hadith which we had very early on in the book. It came in chapter 27, honouring the rights of the Muslims. It comes in Shaykh Albani's version as hadith number 237, and we had it as hadith number 232. And the hadith is indeed reported by Muslim, again in the book of the mosques and places of the prayer, hadith number 657. In the chapter of, and obviously the chapter headings in Muslim being given by An-Nawawi. Chapter 46, the virtue of the Isha prayer and the dawn prayer in congregation. And also reported by Tirmidhi in the book of the times of the prayer, chapter 53, what occurs with regard to the virtue of the Isha and the Fajr prayer, fi jama'ah, in the congregation. Hadith number 222. And also reported by Imam Ahmad. As for the wording that An-Nawawi rahimahullah brings here, then that's more or less the wording, that is the wording about Tirmidhi. The wording of Muslim is slightly longer. It ends with the words فَلَا يَطْلُبَنَّكُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ ذِمَّتِهِ بِشَيْءٍ فَيُدْرِكَهُ فَيَكُبَّهُ فِي نَارِ جَهَنَّمٍ. And the wording of Muslim finishes up, so do not let Allah have to call you to account for anything lying under His protection, for He will catch him and throw him down upon his face in the fire of hell. As for the companion who reports this hadith, then we had his biography a long time ago under hadith number 232. With that being such a long time ago, we'll mention very briefly a brief biography of him again, that he is Jundub, and his name can be pronounced either way. It's correct either way, Jundub or Jundab. Both are correct, with a dhamma or with a fatha on the dal. Jundub or Jundab, either is correct. Jundub ibn Abdullah ibn Sufyan. And here he's mentioned, I know before he mentioned him by his name, Jundub ibn Abdullah, by his father's name. Here he mentions him by his grandfather's name. His name, Jundub, and his grandfather's name. So his actual name, his full name was Jundub, the son of Abdullah, the son of Sufyan. And his kunya was Abu Abdullah, and he was Al-Bajali Al-Alaqi. He settled in the city of Kufa, and then he moved to the city of Basra, and he died between the year 60 and 70. And he reported 43 hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the two Sahihs there are 12 hadith from them. With regard to the words or one phrase in the hadith, فَهُوَ فِي ذِمَّةِ اللَّهِ, that whoever prays the dawn prayer, then he is in fi dhimmatillah. With regard to this phrase, then Shaykh al-Albani mentioned, meaning fi hifdhihi, means he's under the protection of Allah. Likewise, Al-Qurtubi said in his explanation of Muslim, Al-Mufhim, he said, meaning he is under the safeguard of Allah and within his protection, meaning he has sought the protection of Allah the Most High, and Allah the Most High has granted him protection. So therefore it is not right that anyone should afflict him with any harm or with any trouble. I mean, the person who's prayed the Fajr prayer, it's not right that anyone else should afflict him with any harm or any trouble. And whoever does so, then Allah will seek his right from him. I mean, Allah has granted him protection, and you've attacked him. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, Allah will seek you for doing that. And whoever Allah seeks out will find no place to flee to, nor any place of refuge. And this contains a severe threat for those who attack the people who pray, and an encouragement upon being present at the Fajr prayer, at the dawn prayer. Then, with regard to the points of benefit that can be derived from the hadith, and amongst them are the following 2 points of benefit from what we just heard there, from Al-Qurtubi and Al-Mufhim, the first of them being that this hadith contains an encouragement upon being present at the subh, at the dawn prayer. And secondly, that it contains a severe threat for those who attack the people who pray. Again, a side point for us to bear in mind is that obviously when we read a hadith about it mentions a certain reward, obviously naturally we think first and foremost for ourselves that a person's keen to try and get that reward, or think of himself with regard to that reward. But then this gives us the aspect there. We should also think about the other people who obtain that reward, about the rest of the people who pray Fajr. Therefore, the person might think, for example, okay, now I'm under Allah's guarantee of protection, but you should also look, what about the rest of your brothers, the rest of the Muslims? They have that, they're under that protection. So therefore, this is drawing our attention to the point. Be careful what you do with regard to the rights of the Muslims. Be careful with regard to attacking and harming them. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala Muhammad. We'll carry on with the narrations next time, inshaAllah. Just in case anyone's wondering, hasn't noticed and wondering what's going on, then the times have changed. The Isha prayer, for those who haven't heard, most people have probably heard, just in case haven't, the Isha time now is 6:45, inshaAllah, and then the lessons are after that. Alhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala Muhammad. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. The preceding has been a presentation of Al-Maktabatu Salafiyya and SalafiBookstore.com. We are a registered charitable non-profit organization located in the United Kingdom, which promotes Islamic da'wah through various platforms, including the Salafi Masjid and Islamic Center located in Birmingham, UK, our full and part-time Islamic school, our Islamic websites and affiliates such as Salaf.com, SalafiPublications.com, TheNobleQuran.com, and our other numerous websites, our Islamic seminars, classes, lectures, and events, our non-Muslim and media outreach programs towards promoting positive understanding of Islam, and numerous other charitable Islamic projects. You may contact us online at www.salafipublications.com. You may order products at www.salafibookstore.com. You may email us at inquiries@salafipublications.com. For order inquiries, at orders@salafibookstore.com. You may reach us by phone at 0121 773 0003, by fax at 0121 773 4882, and in person or by mail at Salafi Bookstore and Islamic Center, 472 Coventry Road, Small Heath, Birmingham, West Midlands, United Kingdom, B100UG. وجزاكم الله خير وبارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.